So in 1997, the industry was having this collective nervous breakdown over 3D graphics. I mean, Square had just released Final Fantasy VII, a game that was less a product and more a cultural reset. It had pre-rendered cutscenes and a budget that felt like somebody at Square discovered an infinite money glitch. It also convinced every teenager alive that a 6-foot-long sword was also a practical fashion choice. Therefore, when Final Fantasy Tactics showed up that same year in Japan and landed in the West a few months after Final Fantasy VII, it looked like a clerical error. I mean, it used isometrics, it had sprites, the menus looked like a goddamn spreadsheet. On paper, it was a regression. In reality, it was a Trojan horse. Square had spent millions convincing us that the future was about spectacle, but Tactics was about to prove that the most immersive thing in the world is a well-written tragedy. So there's this persistent myth that Tactics was the B-team project, a polite way of saying that it was the game that Square made while all the important people were busy. But side projects, they have a habit of becoming dangerous, especially when you give it to somebody like Asumi Matsuno. Matsuno didn't come from the traditional Save the Crystal school of RPG design. He was an outsider. He had just finished a game called Tactics Ogre, and he brought over with him a team of developers who, seemed more interested in the medieval politics theory than they did the fantasy trope. And here's the part that most people miss. This wasn't just some random afterthought. I mean, the core concept of this game was cultivated in Square as early as 1993, and then once production finally got moving in the mid-90s, that's when they handed the wheels over to Matsuno. The development was problematic. Actually, you know what? Let's call it what it was. It was a pain in the ass because they were building battles on a 3D isometric map with rotating cameras on a PlayStation that was always just one bad effect away from having a panic attack. More importantly, they were writing a script that was so dense, it would probably make an historian sweat. The shock isn't that the game was good. It was that it was allowed to exist at all. At a time when the industry was pivoting more towards action, Matsuno was building a game that the most important button you could press was read. He was betting on the idea that the adult audience would care more about the corruption of the church and the fallout of a class-based civil war than they would about fancy summonses. He was right, but he was also about to run into a problem he couldn't control: the English language. When the game finally left Japan, it hit a wall. And that wall was the American localization process of the late 90s, a period where translation was less about linguistics and more about triage. The original English script for Final Fantasy Tactics remains infamous. It gave us the legendary little money line, a moment where the meaning survives, but the English arrives looking like it was thrown down a flight of stairs. It had characters debating theology, bloodline, and the weaponization of fate, while the text boxes were riddled with grammatical collapses and lines that felt like they were fed through a meat grinder. In any other medium, it would have been a death sentence. It should have turned a sweeping political epic into a comedy of errors. But a funny thing happens when you give a masterpiece a broken voice. It becomes a mystery. Because the language was fractured and sometimes unintentionally cryptic, it forced the audience to pay attention. We weren't just playing a game, we were decrypting a damaged manuscript. We had to fill in the gaps ourselves. Therefore, the broken English accidentally reinforced the atmosphere. It felt distant. It felt ancient. It felt like something we weren't supposed to be reading. It's one of the rare times in tech history where a complete lack of quality control accidentally resulted in prestige world building. If you look past the typos, you find the most cold-blooded story Square has ever dared to tell. Most RPGs of that era followed a very comfortable script. A group of teenagers find a magic stone, realize they're the chosen ones, kill a god, save the world. It's clean, it's heroic. It's also incredibly safe. Tactics chose to be dangerous. The game follows two men, Ramza and Delita. So Ramza is a noble who realizes that his family is corrupt and decides to do the right thing even if it costs him everything. Delita is a commoner who realizes the world is basically just a meat grinder for the poor, so he decides to become the one turning the handle. Here's the 360-degree truth about this game. Ramza is the protagonist. Delita is the winner. By the end of the story, Ramza saves the literal world from a demonic apocalypse. But because he did it outside the system, the church labels him a heretic, he's hunted, his name is spat upon, and he disappears into the fog of history. Meanwhile, Delita, who betrayed, murdered, and manipulated his way to the top, is crowned king and hailed as this legendary hero. It's a bitter adult realization. I mean, it tells the players that the history books are written by the survivors, not the saints. The game basically asks you, are you willing to save the world if you knew for a fact no one would ever thank you for it? To facilitate this misery, Matsuno gave us the job system. On the surface, it's basically a sandbox with infinite possibility. I mean, you want to be a ninja that casts white magic? Sure. You want to be a calculator that can end the battle before it even starts? Go for it. It's basically a playground. But beneath the fun is a brutal simulation of social mobility. You start as a squire or a chemist. You are at the bottom of the barrel. To become anything better, a knight, a mage, a samurai, you have to grind. You have to extract value from your current position to unlock privileges for your next one. Therefore, the game loop perfectly mirrors the narrative. In the story, characters are obsessed with their ranks and bloodlines. In the gameplay, you're obsessed with your job title or GP. You aren't just playing a strategy game, you're participating in the very system of status that the story is trying to deconstruct. I mean, it's brilliant. And it's also why nearly 30 years later, every other tactical RPG is still trying to figure out how Matsuno made menus feel like destiny. Every masterpiece needs a ghost story, and Tactics has several. Because the game was so dense and the English translation was so frustratingly rough, fans swore that there were secrets buried in the code. People spend hours trying to save Teta, convinced that, if they just leveled up enough or stood on the right tile, they could change the outcome. You can't. The game's greatest cruelty is its permanence. But the real conspiracy isn't a hidden character, it's the frame story itself. The entire game is presented as a recovered historical record, the Durai Report, compiled by a historian named Alonzo J. Durai, working from accounts that the official powers tried to bury. That means the story isn't framed as entertainment, it's framed as evidence. Therefore, the rough edges, the confusion, the distance, that all feels like you're peeking through a cracked window, holding a document that the world tried to burn. You're not just playing a game, you're basically helping a dead man clear his name. It treats you like a researcher, not a customer. So how do we categorize this? Is it a masterpiece or just a polished piece of 90s nostalgia? Well, if you think about it, I think it's actually a warning. Final Fantasy Tactics is one of the rare times a major studio put a story this cynical front and center and still shipped it with the full weight of the Final Fantasy name. I mean, shortly after this, the industry moved towards engagement and empowerment. Games started wanting to make you feel like a god. They started wanting to give you the good ending if you checked all the boxes. Tactics didn't care about your feelings. It's a game where the most heroic character ends up dead and forgotten and the villain ends up on the throne. It's a pain in the ass to play, the camera angles are consistently blocked by buildings, and that difficulty spike makes you want to throw your controller to the sun. But it has a soul, and that soul is made of grit and 32-bit sprites and a deep, abiding respect for the audience's ability to handle the truth. It's a reminder that tech history isn't just a list of specs, it's a list of risks. And this was one of the risks that actually paid off. If you haven't played Tactics in 20 years, then it's probably better than you remember. If you've never played it before, then just be warned, because this game doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't care if you win. It really only cares that you remember what happened, because in the end, history is really just a story we tell to make the winners feel better. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you so much for checking it out. If you enjoyed it, come back. If you didn't, thank you for checking this one out. And until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and for the love of God, always keep a backup save file. Peace out.